Good afternoon. I'm Simone Cavallaro, Director of the Stigler Center. Today, we're happy to host Stacy Mitchell and Steve Kaplan for a conversation on the effects of the COVID crisis on Amazon and its competitors, moderated by Jake Schlesinger. Before we begin, please note, we're on the record and live streaming on our YouTube channel. If you have any questions for the speakers, we will address them in the last 15 minutes of the webinar. You can submit them via the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. As usual, views expressed by our guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. We hope you will join us for more upcoming webinars, so please check our website. Also, check our podcast, Capital Isn't, and promarket.org, the publication of the Stigler Center. Back to this afternoon. Please allow me to briefly introduce our speakers. Stacy Mitchell is a co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which produces research and partners with allies to reverse corporate concentration and strengthen local economies. Her cover feature on Amazon for the Nation was described as the essential piece of journalism, and her co-author report, Amazon's Stranglehold, has drawn praise for illuminating the company's power and impact. She also written for The Atlantic, Bloomberg, Washington Monthly, and the Wall Street Journal. And she's the author of the book, Big Box Swindle. A few weeks ago, Stacy was also featured prominently in the New York Times long piece. Welcome, Stacy. Thanks for being with us today. Our other speakers today is Steve Kaplan, who is a return guest on Stigler programs. Thank you, Steve. It's always a pleasure to have you. Steve is the Neubauer Family Distinguished Service Professor of Entrepreneurship and Finance at Booth and the Kasnick Faculty Director of the Postwar Center. A Fortune magazine article referred to him as probably the foremost private equity scholar in the galaxy, while Business Week named him one of the top 12 business school teachers in the country. His research focuses on private equity, venture capital, entrepreneurial finance, and corporate governance, among others. He is also the co-creator of the Kaplan Score PME private equity benchmarking approach and co-founded the entrepreneurship program at Booth, among many other achievements. Our moderator today is Jake Schlesinger, who is a senior correspondent in the Washington Bureau of the Wall Street Journal. Jake has been covering the economic policy response to the COVID crisis, as well as the economics in the 2020 campaign. Previously, he covered trade and globalization, serving as the journal's global financial regulation editor, as well as deputy Washington Bureau chief and Tokyo Bureau chief and Japan editor. Among many accomplishments, Jake was a member of the journal team that won the 2003 Pulitzer Prize. In 2018, Jake was also Stigler Center Journalist in Residence, and we thank him again for his contributions. Welcome, Jake. Great to see you again.
Thank you.
And now, without further ado, I turn it over to our speakers.
Great. Well, thank you, Simone, for setting this up. And I want to thank all of the people who have taken the time in this post-Memorial Day, beautiful day to log in from wherever you are. I'm going to start with just a couple of quick observations to set the table for today's discussion. We all know that Amazon had been playing an incredibly important role in the American economy before the pandemic, and that the past few weeks have only highlighted that position. Speaking personally, since I started working remotely 2.5 months ago, my company has required me to use Amazon Work services in order to log into our restricted company computer system. Unable to go to movie theaters, to concerts, to plays, to bars. I've turned a lot more heavily to Amazon Prime for my evening's entertainment. Unable to go to restaurants. I've spent a lot more of my paycheck at Amazon's Whole Foods, especially with 2 daughters at home relying on free room and board. And looking more broadly, I want to just flag 2 data points. First, at a time when most companies in the last 2 months, especially traditional retailers, have been slashing their workforce, Amazon, which was already the country's 2nd largest employer before the pandemic, has hired about 175,000 new workers and boosted its payroll by about 40%. Second, while the S&P 500 stock index was, as of close of trading Friday, down 9% for the year, Amazon's share price over that same period has risen 28%. All of which is to say that this is a timely and significant subject before us today. And we're going to begin the conversation by having each of our panelists give a few minutes of their overview on the pandemic and Amazon, and then have a conversation between the three of us. And then, as Simone said, we will invite the viewers for questions and comments at about 15 minutes to the hour. So Stacy, let's start with you. You've written a lot, as Simone mentioned, extensively about Amazon over the last few years. Give us a summary of some of the things that you have written and how, if at all, the pandemic has changed or reinforced those views.
Yes, thank you. Well, it's great to be here. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be part of a Stigler Center event. And so thanks to everyone for having me and for organizing this. I run the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which is a nonprofit research and policy organization, and we work to reverse the concentration of economic power and to expand the capacity of citizens and communities to shape their own future. We were founded in 1974 with this kind of Brandeisian view of the world, and that was, of course, at a time when the ideas of the Chicago School were really ascendant, and so we've been swimming upstream for a long time. But recently, it's been nice to see that the tide has begun to shift, and there's a little bit more questioning going on about kind of levels of concentration and monopoly power in the economy. So by way of background, much of my research has focused on independent businesses, local economies, the retail sector, all of which led me many years ago to begin looking at Amazon, which has been a significant focus of my work over the last 7 or 8 years or so. And I thought I would just give sort of a basic overview, as you suggested, Jake, of the basic concern that I have about Amazon's market power, and then look a little bit at the implications of the pandemic. Amazon really increasingly controls the basic infrastructure for a growing share of our commerce. 2/3 of Americans who were looking to buy something online last year began their product search on Amazon. That's up from about 1/3 5 years ago. And what this means is that any company that makes or retails any consumer good and wants to reach an online market really has little choice but to sell on Amazon's platform, either as a supplier to Amazon's retail division or as a third-party seller on its marketplace. Similarly, Amazon Web Services accounts for about 48% of the world's public cloud computing capacity. It functions as the infrastructure for a huge number of companies. For software developers, what this means is that they must integrate their apps with AWS. Doing so, of course, is risky because Amazon has repeatedly copied popular applications and then given its own versions more favorable positioning on AWS. Likewise, Amazon's voice interface, Alexa, now dominates the voice market. It's integrated into more than 80,000 products. And with Alexa, Jeff Bezos has really yet again positioned Amazon as an intermediary between businesses and their customers. And we see Amazon repeating this pattern as it moves into new areas. Its logistics operation is now delivering both its own packages and those of other firms, and now rivals both the US Postal Service and Fed in terms of scale. As we watch it move into healthcare, again, we see sort of the outlines of a kind of infrastructural role with Amazon, creating a kind of platform that will handle exchanges among hospitals, pharmacies, and insurers, and so on and so forth. Controlling the economy's core infrastructure gives Amazon really extraordinary structural power. In many ways. For one, it affords the company a kind of godlike view of much of what is happening, allowing it to spy not only on us as consumers, but also on its competitors. And that nets at a huge trove of data, which gives Amazon really a kind of built-in advantage in every new market, every new industry that it seeks to go into. Having gatekeeper power also allows Amazon to dictate to both suppliers and competitors the terms by which they can access markets. And it gives them the power to punish those who dare to resist its demands. You know, with a flick of a switch, Amazon can bury a promising new product or capsize a thriving business. Amazon also, as a gatekeeper, has the ability to levy tolls on a large swath of economic activity. You know, over the last year, Amazon has netted over $50 billion in fees from third-party sellers on its marketplace. That's about twice what it was getting 3 years ago. And absent any real competing alternatives for reaching the market, these fees are kind of compulsory. They're a form of tax. And so I think, you know, in essence, what my argument has been about Amazon is that they've assumed a kind of governing power, that they are increasingly regulating our commerce. And in the context of the pandemic, their market power has been magnified and fortified in many ways. As Jake noted, you know, much of the physical world has now collapsed, and we are increasingly reliant on the online world with a handful of companies that really mediate a lot of those transactions, a lot of the exchange of information and goods. And, you know, we're dealing with a situation, a pandemic, and particularly a policy response to the pandemic that really threatens to cause an extinction level event among small brick and mortar businesses, which play a really crucial role in the vitality of our economy, our industries, and our communities. And I guess I want to just close by noting briefly 3 of the conclusions that I've drawn in my work, and I won't offer any detail about these. Maybe we can sort of get into them during the course of the conversation. But one is that consolidating this kind of structural power has significant negative impacts on society, that it's a major driver of inequality, that it threatens innovation, and that ultimately it poses a threat even to democracy. Second, that Amazon has attained its dominance in part by employing the strategies of a monopolist, and has been able to get away with that because of lax and misguided approaches to antitrust enforcement. And finally, much of Amazon's market power lies in its ability, it's not so much its dominance of any one particular business, but that it really lies in the fact that Amazon is a multitude of different things. And its market power lies in its ability to leverage the interplay between different parts of its business. So for example, by allowing a lot of counterfeiting and kind of chaos on its marketplace, that gives Amazon significant leverage over suppliers, and it uses that leverage to exact discounts and other concessions. So I say that because I think as we think about what is the solution to Amazon's market power, how do we address this from a policy perspective, breaking it up is not the only thing that we need to do, but from my point of view, it's an essential part of the solution. And I will leave it at that.
Great, thank you, Stacy. That's a great overview. Steve, why don't you take it away and give us your perspective on Amazon in general and then through the pandemic.
Great. Again, thanks for having me. It's great to be here, and we should have some fun. So I'm going to do 3 things. I'll talk about the effect of COVID on Amazon, a little bit what I expect going forward, and then I'll close with should Amazon be regulated or broken up. So, Jake, more or less said about what COVID has done with Amazon. Their sales are up significantly in the pandemic, and it's kind of continued or accelerated what was already happening. And just to put numbers on it, Amazon had $300 billion in revenue last year. This year, first quarter, $75 billion. 10 was Amazon Web Services, 65 was the rest. And they're expecting revenues to be up about 20% this year, so they'll have about $360 billion in revenue. So continuing what's already been happening, and as Jake said, thank goodness, consumers can buy without risking exposure to the virus, many who are at risk. Amazon Web Services allows Zoom and many other businesses to operate remotely. And arguably having Amazon here as this huge company has saved many lives and reduced the incidence and transmission of COVID. So very glad they're here. A few things they said in their first quarter results. They expect to make $4 billion in operating profit in Q2, but they're going to spend $4 billion on COVID, which will maybe erase that. They're focusing on keeping employees employees safe and customers happy. As Jake said, they hired 175,000 new workers, increased pay for those workers by $2 an hour. They paused loan repayments to third-party sellers. And I should also add, and this is a little bit in contradiction to what Stacy said, they have more than 15,000 small and medium-sized businesses that had more than $1 million in revenue on Amazon stores. So it's not as if all the small and medium-sized businesses are dying. 15,000 are doing quite well. What do I expect going forward? I expect the trends to continue. When COVID has passed or is manageable, people will go back to stores, but online market share will have increased and will continue to. And Amazon Web Services in the cloud, that's going to continue to grow. So, and in fact, more people may work remotely post-pandemic. You have Facebook saying they're going to let their employees work remotely if they want to. So this trend is going to continue. And Amazon is investing aggressively and will continue to. So this is an important thing I'll come back to later. Last year, their operating cash flow was up $6 billion. Their capital expenditures were up by $7 billion. And they're spending about $20 billion a year on capital expenditures. So it's worth pointing out, and also in terms of what's happened and what's going forward, Amazon is pretty extraordinary, and so is Jeff Bezos. It is extremely well managed, and unusually so. They have an operating model that's obsessed with customers. They're obsessed with hiring the best talent. They use data. They are relentless about inventing things, and they go quickly. So it's not an accident they've done well. They've done well because they're superior at operating in many ways. And Bezos himself, if you have done work on what you look for in CEOs, and he kind of embodies the two key qualities in top CEOs, that they are strong on creativity and strategy, and they're strong on execution. So I expect Amazon to continue doing well. That success has attracted and will continue to attract a huge amount of scrutiny from critics like Stacy. And that can be a good thing because I think it helps Amazon get better. But that brings up the question of whether Amazon should be broken up or regulated. So let me get to that. I mean, can you imagine what life would be like in the pandemic if Amazon had been heavily regulated or broken up? You would have had fewer deliveries or essentials. You would have taken more trips and put yourself at risk in supermarkets. Amazon Web Services is not that old. You might not have had Amazon Web Services. You wouldn't have necessarily had Zoom. So we're pretty lucky they're here. And then Amazon does have some competition. In retail sales, Amazon had about $260 billion in 2019. Walmart had over $500 billion. Costco, $150 billion. And in the pandemic, Amazon's share of online sales has actually declined. They've gone up by less than Walmart, Target, and others. So it's not as if there isn't competition. And then in the cloud, there's Azure at Microsoft, there's Google, there's Oracle, there's Alibaba. And Azure just won a big Pentagon contract over Amazon Web Services. So it's not as if they're operating without competition. And in terms of breaking them up, people say, oh, let's just break them up. Remember, Amazon's spending $20 billion a year on capital expenditures, and a lot of that is fixed. So if you break them up, and let's say there are 4 Amazons, you're probably going to get less innovation and less investment in infrastructure, because they can't just do 4 times 20 billion if a lot of that is fixed, and that would come down, and that would be a bit problematic. And let me just end. I just want to give you a couple of interesting quotes, and then I'll stop. But here's something that I read recently. It says, "The world has never known a company with such ambition, capability, and momentum. Its marketplace is hard to overstate. It controls a large and rapidly increasing share of the business done by almost every US consumer products company. Suppliers' growing dependence on it is a huge issue, not only for manufacturers, but also for the US economy." That was Walmart, 2003, Business Week. Amazon is not new in that regard. And then I can give from the New York Times a couple of years ago, the orders poured in from everywhere, so much so that the company became an economic force. It could make or break suppliers by promoting their products. It could dictate terms on manufacturing. Its headquarters cities boomed as this tech-driven retailer built huge warehouses and factories. That was Sears in the early 1900s. So every so often, you have a dominant player or a player that's doing very well. And over time, competition emerges and someone else takes over. And in the meantime, consumers do really, really well. So I will stop there.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Steve. Stacy, I imagine there's probably a whole long list of things you'd like to respond to there, but let me try and channel the conversation and give you a chance to do so in a few different iterations. But let me start with Steve's noticeable and sort of pointed and perhaps controversial assertion, which is essentially, thank goodness we had Amazon during the pandemic. Without Amazon in its current form, we all would have been worse off. I'd like to hear your response to that broad assertion. As I say, we can then get into some of the specifics.
Yeah, that's great. I think Jeff Bezos has long employed this strategy of trying to conflate all of the advantages and innovations that come with e-commerce and home delivery with Amazon's power. I remember quite a number of years ago, he was on Charlie Rose, and he was asked about, at that time, Amazon had spent many years losing colossal sums of money selling books at a loss, and had succeeded in taking over more than half of book sales, causing a lot of decimation among other book retailers who didn't have the backing from Wall Street to enable them to lose that kind of money. And so he's on Charlie Rose, and Rose asked him about Amazon's power in the book industry, and Bezos said, Amazon did not happen to the book business. The future happened to the book business, right? And so there is this way in which Amazon is sort of hidden behind the innovations that have come with e-commerce as an excuse for the kind of market power that it has. I think the real danger that we face right now is not that we're going to lose out on e-commerce. Lots of other companies can do this, and we could have a more diverse mix of businesses providing e-commerce. Instead, it's that we're at risk of allowing Amazon to so dominate this sector that there isn't actually any competition, and that we're risking the new innovations coming along down the road. A lot of the, Amazon, like a lot of these other tech companies that, originally had good ideas, new inventions, changed the way things go, and this is true of Google and Facebook as well. Over time, they have increasingly used their financial might and their market power to sustain that position rather than really being inventive. And a lot of the things we associate with Amazon A lot of the innovations we associate with Amazon are things that it actually bought. It didn't do anything special to get, or that it used its market power to attain. So for example, it's become this huge force in logistics and package delivery. It's now delivering more packages than the Postal Service and almost as many as FedEx, not because it had any great insight or innovation in how to do that, or anything different that it offered to customers, but rather because Amazon essentially said to third-party sellers on its platform, if you want to be placed such that consumers are going to see your product and you're going to make sales, you need to use Fulfillment by Amazon. You need to use our shipping service. And lo and behold, they built on the backbone of that this huge shipping service. Similarly, Alexa is not something that they invented, it's something they acquired. Alexa has a backstory. She used to go by the name Evie. She was created by a UK company that Amazon bought. Its warehouses rely on Kiva robots, again, a company that Amazon bought and then took off the market so that other e-commerce companies couldn't use. So over time, this is a well-run company in many respects, but over time, we more and more see a company using its position to defend its turf and prevent competition. And I think that's the real worry, as we're not seeing those innovations come along.
Let me just push and follow up a little bit on that for a second, which is, I take your point, and we can get into that about Amazon using its power and building more market power and more conglomeration, but speaking selfishly as a consumer, and this will eventually pivot us into an antitrust discussion about which standards you should use. Why should I care about anything that you mentioned? From the standpoint of me sitting in my home during this pandemic, I don't see any of those things. It doesn't really matter to me whether Amazon owns those companies or not. I just know that I can get stuff fairly conveniently that I might not have been able to get before. So help us understand, and again, Steve is saying, thank goodness they're there. We're all better off because of it. Help us understand why that may not necessarily be the truth.
Yeah, well, as a consumer, I guess a couple of things I would say. One is that if we allow the entire distribution system for consumer goods to collapse into a single pipeline, what that means is it's going to be harder for companies to invent new things and find an audience. If you talk to small, mid-sized manufacturers, especially, what they say is that the way that their products often find a market is that they get introduced in relatively small retail stores, brick and mortar stores and the like. They grow through word of mouth, and then eventually maybe they're sold at Target and Walmart and on Amazon. Amazon is very good for search. It's not great for product discovery and for introducing new products. And so by collapsing the sort of diversity of channels that connect producers with consumers, there are fewer and fewer products that can actually make it through and find an audience. And as a consumer, you wouldn't even necessarily know that you're missing something. But if you I've done a number of interviews with toy manufacturers, small and mid-sized toy manufacturers, people in the sporting goods industry. And what they say is that Amazon is squeezing them so much that they don't have room to invest, and that it's become harder and harder for bringing new products to market. So that's one reason we should be concerned. We see this in the book industry, where there is a kind of collapse. More and more of the books that are sold are kind of best sellers and books that by well-known authors. It's become harder for new authors and new books to actually make it and find the audience that they need. That's deeply concerning, and I think should alarm us as consumers. I would also just note that because Amazon relies on dynamic pricing, we've started to lose touch with being able to tell if something is it actually the going rate or is a good price. And during the pandemic, we saw Amazon engage in an enormous amount of price gouging. Not only were there third-party sellers on its platform that spiked prices of high-demand items, and Amazon, of course, took a big cut of that, and it went on for weeks and weeks until policymakers started to call it out. But there's also data to show that Amazon's own prices on those items went up by 50%, not quite as high as the big spikes, but substantially, and were that way, sustained high prices for several weeks. We know that having one company as going from the everything store to the only store is a bad idea as consumers. But lastly, I'll just say, and I won't say too much about this, but I think we have to remember that we're not just consumers. We are people, we are producers of value. We are people who need to earn a living. We are workers, we're entrepreneurs. And Amazon's market power is very much a threat to our ability to earn a living. I think it's a major driver of inequality. And as I said earlier, I think it also threatens our ability as citizens to govern our own economy.
Steve, let me turn this to you and focus with a question that's related to building off of some of the things that Stacy has said today and also in her writing. I mean, what you have done is portrayed Amazon as an innovator and that their success is a result of learning the marketplace and doing better than anybody in new fields. I think what some of the critics would say, and Stacy has been at the forefront of writing about this, is that some of that may well be true, but also that Amazon has taken its unique position with fingers in multiple pies to essentially use monopolist powers in order to expand its power. And in particular, its dual role as both the marketplace and the producer of its own goods. And my own newspaper recently published an investigative piece that talked about how Amazon had used the power of its ability to see how sellers are operating in order to essentially take that information and produce competitive products. So talk a little bit about the ways in which there may be parallels to not just innovation, but also a potential abuse of using its dominant roles in certain sectors.
So, you know, I would say that if they're doing something that's illegal, then you should chasten them or look at them, and I think that's what you're doing. I would say the following: I'm not convinced. And first of all, again, you know, Stacy keeps saying they're the only competitor. There's Walmart.com. There's Costco. There are companies like ShipBob that do logistics for companies that are, you know, not on Amazon. So there is a lot of competition even today. And second, people said exactly the same thing about Sears 100 years ago. They said the same thing about Walmart 15, 20 years ago, and competition continued and emerged. And then the most important sort of response, and this is, you know, related to what you're saying, is that consumers are better off. Amazon's incentive is to get the consumers lower prices. And so the things that Stacy is criticizing Amazon from doing, and that you a little bit did too, is they're giving lower prices to consumers. And this is also, you know, using data to give lower prices. This is exactly what a Walgreens does when they have Walgreens aspirin instead of Bayer, or in addition to Bayer. You have Walgreens aspirin or Walgreens acetaminophen opposite Bayer and Tylenol. They've been doing that for years. Sears did that. Sears had its own home brands. And so the incentive for Amazon to actually lower prices and provide better products is greater than the incentive for other companies, because Amazon gets sort of a double benefit. So at the end of the day, you know, I look at what's happened, and consumers get low prices, and, you know, both Walmart and Amazon and Costco all push that. The consumers are better off. So I just don't see this market power and using market power. And then because Amazon had the infrastructure, they were able to develop Amazon Web Services, and that would not have come if they'd been broken up or smaller. We might not have the cloud to the extent we did. So they've been innovative in ways that are, I think, have been very good for the consumer. And yeah, that's great. I'll add one more point, because I think it's also not quite right on inequality. If you look at inequality since 2000, so the last 20 years, the extent to which inequality has increased has actually been driven not by big corporates, but by small businesses. And one of my colleagues, Eric Zwick, has a couple of papers co-authored with folks at Berkeley and Princeton that shows this, that it's the the smaller entrepreneur, some of whom probably sell on Amazon, who have done very well, but there's been inequality. The good ones have done really well, and probably the not so efficient ones have not done so well. But inequality overall hasn't moved a whole lot in the last 20 years when Amazon's been ascendant. And to the extent it's moved, it's been driven by small business, not big business.
Stacey, let me take part of what Steve was talking about back to you and amplify it a little bit, which is there is a question or a premise here that Amazon is suppressing competition to the point where its power, is hard to attack without perhaps a government remedy, as you both talked about. And one thing that Steve had mentioned, and just to add on to that a little bit, is there are signs in this pandemic, as I said at the outset, where Amazon's power is increasing. There are also signs of vulnerability. We've done big stories about how Amazon's inability to deliver products has opened the door for other online providers in a way that they hadn't before, including, even brand names that used to sell through Amazon mainly, who now find that they can deliver quicker when people go straight to their website. Last week, there were a couple of interesting announcements. In consecutive days, on Tuesday, Facebook announced that they were going to start their own e-commerce platform for small businesses. And in some ways, because they don't do what Amazon does, perhaps offering a friendlier, less threatening channel than Amazon, and perhaps they have the wherewithal and the power to take on Amazon. The day before that, FedEx announced a joint venture with Microsoft, again, two giants that in different ways are threatened by Amazon, both in its cloud services and its delivery, to try and come up with a better supply chain delivery system. And so in a way, you could look at those things and say, well, the pandemic is showing the market works. Amazon's power is, at least the seeds of competition and erosion are happening in ways that we hadn't seen before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the broader trend of the last 30, 40 years has been incredible levels of growing consolidation across a lot of industries. Most industries have become increasingly consolidated. The fact that, we have gone from an economy dominated by Walmart to an economy dominated by Walmart and Amazon in different ways is not necessarily a measure of a competitive economy. Walmart really dominates a significant share of the food sector and causes real problems, and that was true 10 years ago, just to some of the things that Steve quoted, and it's still true today. So the fact that there is a monopoly sort of power that Amazon has online doesn't change any of that, and is not a sign of a competitive economy, which to me really is an economy that is open, has a lot of new entrants, has a lot of dynamism, and a variety of different size firms. What we have seen is a real decline in the number of new businesses that are started each year. We've just seen a real decline in both the number and market share of small businesses across many sectors. We did a survey of independent businesses last year, and among those who were selling on Amazon's platform, only 7% said that it was actually benefiting their bottom line. Yes, they can maybe make some revenue on it, but the fees are so high that they can't, it's not actually profitable. The rules change all the time that they can't really get a toehold. It's difficult to build a relationship with customers. It's an environment that is incredibly, it's like gambling. It's like going to a casino. The house always wins. Maybe you win one hand or what have you, but ultimately the house always wins. That's what Amazon's marketplace is like for third-party sellers. When you talk about Walmart having gained some degree of having, seen an increase on its website during the pandemic, that's talking about going from a few percentage points to a little bit more. When you talk to third-party sellers, many of them, if you ask them, how much of your business do you do on Amazon versus eBay versus Walmart, they will say, I do 80% of my business on Amazon. I do 90% of my business on Amazon. This is a heavily consolidated market where we all know there is one player that really dominates. And to your point, I think we can see, to your sort of question about, does Amazon, I think we can see in Amazon's own behavior that this is not a company that really fears any threat in terms of competition. The only real concern that Jeff Bezos has about Amazon's continued growth and dominance comes from Washington. And that is why he's bought the largest private mansion in the city, why he's set up that mansion with its ballroom to sort of host these parties with people in power. It's why Amazon is now one of the largest lobbying forces in the country, why it's locating its second headquarters outside of Washington, D.C. for all of the sort of soft relationship power that comes from having all of those employees there. I mean, gaming government has been part of Amazon's strategy from the beginning, and it's now a really central part because of that very reason, that there is not a legitimate competitive threat on the horizon.
Thanks. So let me use that as a transition to what I wanted to talk about, which was antitrust policy. And just to say, for those who are viewing, that this will probably be the last question before we turn it over to audience questions, and we're already getting some good questions coming in. Stacey, as you mentioned, one of the things Amazon does fear, presumably, is Washington. There has been growing interest in antitrust, including a look at Amazon, particularly over the last year. The House Judiciary Committee, in particular, their antitrust subcommittee, has started looking at questions. You testified last summer before them on the whole question of online platforms and competition. A report is expected as soon as next month. If you could start by saying, if you were sort of crafting what you consider to be an appropriate antitrust remedy for Amazon, what would it be? And then Steve, I'd like you to respond in terms of how you feel what would be appropriate, inappropriate with that, and what would be the problems with what it is that Stacey's proposing. So Stacey, you go first.
Sure. I mean, I guess three things I would suggest. One is that I think that we need to break up Amazon along its lines of business. And so I think there's an inherent conflict between being the marketplace and also competing with the businesses that rely on that marketplace to reach customers. And therefore, I think the marketplace needs to be a standalone operation, separate from Amazon as a retailer and Amazon as a manufacturer of products. This is something that we've encountered before in the past, most famously with railroads, in the early days of railroads. Those who controlled the rails also had interests in goods that moved on the rails, and they would use their power over the rails to disadvantage their competitors in those other industries. Congress outlawed that in a law in 1906, and I think similarly we need to think about that in the context of the pieces of Amazon that are infrastructure need to be separate from Amazon's divisions that compete on that infrastructure. I think we need to spin off Amazon's logistics from its platform, because it is clearly used its power over marketplace sellers to compel them to use its logistics division. And so I think those kinds of separations along the lines of business is one thing. Second, we need some sort of oversight of, for these dominant digital platforms, as intermediaries, as a kind of public utility, if you will, what are their obligations to behave in a way that is non-discriminatory against, so that they can't discriminate against the various market participants who use those platforms. There needs to be some public oversight there. And then I guess third, I would just say that I think we do need to really look at the beefing up or sort of recovering parts of antitrust. For example, we used to prosecute predatory pricing. We no longer do that. That's something that Amazon behavior that Amazon consistently engages in historically and even today in order to gain market share. I also think we need to look at acquisitions. If you're a dominant company like that, should you be allowed to acquire anybody, even very small companies? Because we see in tech a lot of acquisitions where the goal is to take innovators and new technologies off the market. And I think we've seen that with Amazon.
Right. Steve, before I turn it over to you, actually, I was going to just make one observation based on what Stacey just said. That's interesting, whichever side of the question you're on, which is Amazon in the last month got approval in UK from their competition authorities to make an investment in Deliveroo, the fast food, or the food delivery service. What was interesting about that is that until the pandemic, the competition authorities had been skeptical about allowing that investment, worried about Amazon's power. after the pandemic hit and the company essentially was struggling and probably was in danger of going out of business, the competition authorities had said, you know, it's better to have Amazon invest than to have the company go out of business from the standpoint of competition. So it just further shows the importance of the whole question of acquisitions at this moment, perhaps more so even than it was a few months ago. So Steve, over to you. What's your response?
Let me start off by just saying again, I don't think Stacy has responded to the fact that Amazon is good for consumers. And if they are really bad for their suppliers, the suppliers are going to go somewhere else like a Facebook or a Walmart, and Amazon is not in their incentive to have that. Now coming to antitrust and what we see there. This Amazon is not unique in that there has been an increase in concentration across the economy, and you know, Stacy mentioned that, and it's global. And the best work on that is David Autor and Larry Katz and others who are MIT, Harvard, and they actually, and one of their co-authors is going to be joining our faculty in the fall. What they find is that these more concentrated companies the superstar companies in the more concentrated industries are the ones that are more productive and the ones that are more innovative. And they ascribe the greater profitability of these companies not to market power, but to the fact that they are more efficient. And the other piece of evidence that they use to say that it's not market power is that this is true across the world. And it's true in Europe, where antitrust is much tougher. It's true in the US. And so it seems to them that these superstar firms are firms, you know, as I said, like Amazon, that are doing better because of technology, because of the nature of competition, and that is a good thing for consumers. They make money, but it is a good thing for consumers. And let me just say, even if you were going to come up with the conclusion that there was a natural monopoly, that they did have market power, you know, this is where I'll go to Milton Friedman, since this is Chicago and you mentioned the Chicago School. And, you know, he said there's no good solution in that circumstance. The choice is among three evils. One is government run. And oh my God, we don't want that. That's, you know, the CDC has not covered itself in glory. You could be regulated by the state or broken up. And as I said before, if you do that, there's going to be a lot of wasteful and duplicative capital expenditures among the breakups. And then one of them may emerge anyway, or a Walmart or a Costco may emerge, and you'll end up in the same place. And, you know, the last choice is unregulated. And his inclination was be unregulated as long as it is tolerable, because there is competition. It is an innovative society, and things change, like Sears, like Walmart once being dominant, and size is very hard to manage. So his view, inclination to be unregulated as long as it is tolerable. And given that the consumer is really benefiting now, I would say it's quite tolerable.
Thanks. We're now at the point where we've promised the viewers we would take some of their questions, and I've been scrolling through some of these. There are a lot of great questions, some overlap. So I'm going to combine a couple to turn to something that we have not talked about, which is Amazon and the labor market, which has also gotten a lot of attention in the pandemic. As I had mentioned, Amazon has done a lot of hiring at a time when other people are laying off. On the other hand, it's also gotten a lot of negative attention due to complaints from workers and allegations about how it's treated its workers. Brett Wallace was asking, why do they fire employees for speaking out against unsafe conditions, which is a complaint that a number of employees have made. Amazon has not denied firing workers who have complained, but has denied any cause and effect. Daniel Harris asks, saying Amazon has raised its wages, but there's also a vicious crackdown on labor organizing. And at the end of the day, there's still Amazon workers on food stamps. And so and then Steve, I think you mentioned they did raise their pay at the beginning. I believe that as of either the end of May or end of June, they are going to roll back the pay to what it had been before the pandemic. There was a $2 bonus that they had added. So I don't know which one of you wants to go first, but to talk about, in a sense, how the pandemic has cast a spotlight on they've treated their workers.
I would say they're not perfect, and Walmart, has a history of not being perfect, but they have every incentive to get it right, and that's over time. I think Walmart has made some changes and has improved conditions. And I would just say, if the conditions were that terrible and they treated their employees that badly, people wouldn't work for them. And people do. They obviously hired a lot of people, and it's their incentive to get the people to be productive, but to be happy, because if they're not, then they're going to be less effective, and B, they get all this attention that they're getting now.
Stacey.
Yeah, to the question of why Amazon fired employees who spoke out about concerns around transmission of COVID and whether the company needed to do more to protect workers, the reason that Amazon fired those employees is because Amazon is a bully, and a bully is a kind of more of a layman's term for what a monopoly is. It's when you have enough power to push other people around and get them to do your bidding. And that's exactly what we see Amazon do in the marketplace and with regard to its employees. We did a wage analysis a few years back and found that Amazon across 11 different markets paid significantly lower wages than similar kinds of jobs at other warehouses. As they have gained more market power in the logistics industry, they have been a force for actually pushing down wages and pushing down working conditions. They did provide a very small amount of hazard pay to workers during the pandemic, in part because they really needed to try to retain as many people, in their warehouses. And as you noted, that hazard pay ends on Sunday, even though obviously the public health threat and the threat to these workers really continues. The idea that you can simply go work somewhere else, I think is, sort of hard to keep a straight face about in the context not only of this economy, but all, the current state of mass unemployment that we're in, but also just more broadly, even before the pandemic. Amazon is 1 out of every 4 warehouse jobs in the country, and in certain markets, an even larger share of those jobs. And there's good, economics scholarship recently that has shown that part of the failure of wages at the low end to keep up in recent years is because of growing consolidation and the fact that there just isn't competition for labor the way that there used to be. We are, I just want to quickly say, from the standpoint of most Americans, this is not an economy that feels like they have any options in at all. That they are really at the mercy of corporations that control their day-to-day lives. And we've seen a level of inequality we haven't experienced since the 1920s. It's no coincidence that that has gone hand in hand with extraordinary levels of concentrated power, and that Jeff Bezos is the richest person in the world.
Steve, sorry, you wanted to jump in. Go.
No, I think you're confusing a few things. I think their technological change has been a big driver of that, and that is a real challenge because it has affected the entire country. I wouldn't single out Amazon as being the only company that has had an effect. And again, Walmart, people have the same criticisms, but I would still say, pre-pandemic, and this will be true post-pandemic, if you treat your employees badly, you will start losing employees to other companies and you will lose competitive position. And I think Costco showed that with Walmart. Walmart has gotten better because Costco had a somewhat different model. And I would expect that to be the case with Amazon.
I wanted to Oh, go
really
ahead, say some quickly, but
yeah, but just to really say, technology is a constant. Technological change has existed, since the beginning of time, and that's different. Inequality is not a product of technology; it's a product of policy choices, and that's why we need to make different policy choices now.
Yeah,
I should say I'm gonna give you guys each a chance to make sort of wrap up comments, but I also do want to, for our audience's sake, give them a chance to ask some of their questions as well. There are a couple on a similar theme on network effects. One from Ira Weiss. How should we think about network effects of a company like Amazon relative to the network effects of companies like Walmart and Sears? And this gets back to antitrust. Should they be updated to consider network effects? Does that somehow change how we look at that? And then a similar question from Priyank Bahaguna, which is, what is your view of the capacity of antitrust authorities to deal with the latest challenge of two-sided platforms where generally customers are better off and the regular frame of customer surplus is not sufficient? What about looking into disruptive innovation? So again, I will let you, whoever wants to jump in first, but I think fundamentally, are these companies, not just Amazon, but Google, Facebook, are they fundamentally different in a way that sort of old tools or old theories of antitrust and concentration don't apply, and we need to adapt or change them in some way? Steve, I guess you're laughing, so I'll let you go first.
That's a really complicated, hard question, which is why I go back to the fact that prices are lower, consumers are benefiting, and until you see, because there are two effects to these network effects. A, you get these companies are more productive. B, they may have some market power, and the question is, how are consumers doing? And I think that's my touchstone, and consumers are doing very well. And until you see that they're not, my inclination is to say, let's let it go. And I trust in competition and innovation over time. And that would be where I would come out. And Walmart and Sears, they had their own kind of network effects as well by being big retailers, lots of manufacturers, lots of customers. Amazon now being online is a little different, but it's sort of the same concept. And you have Walmart being online, you have other online providers. So, Facebook you mentioned is coming, Google is there. So there are these countervailing forces. And again, when I see the consumers doing so well, I'm inclined to keep hands off.
So Steve, we had a similar comment echoing what you've said from Aditya G that says Amazon multiple domain presence is helping create an ecosystem. They're in technology, e-commerce, streaming, music, and now in food. Is this not creating more convenience to consumers? Consumer is the king, ! So where's the harm? Stacy, over to you. And actually, I should also say you had started at the beginning talking about the Chicago stool and the Brandeisian view, and I had meant to push you to define those. I mean, the Brandeisian view is looking at antitrust from a holistic standpoint. The Chicago school, oversimplifying a bit, has boiled down antitrust to the question of what does this mean for consumers? So I guess you could perhaps address both of those aspects.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot there. I think this notion that the consumers are doing well. I think most Americans don't feel like we're better off. I think we've had many years of growing consolidation. We've seen big tech really increasingly become gatekeepers, mediating a growing share of our commerce and communications. And I think most Americans would say that they're not better off, that they're deeply concerned both about their economic well-being, but also the ways in which the power of these companies really threatens our democratic institutions and way of life. So I think that's the big picture of what most people are experiencing. And I think if we fail to address that, we're going to increasingly live in a country that's unrecognizable to us in terms of our basic values of equality, fairness, opportunity, democracy. I think all of those things are very much at risk because of the power of big tech companies. I think we have a long experience as consumers of seeing single companies come to control whole markets and finding that that doesn't serve us very well in the long term. And so I think there's also a history there. I find it funny to think about, sort of the notion that Walmart's market power is somehow a counterpoint as opposed to a step on this evolution that Amazon is a worse version of in many respects. But it is not as though Walmart dominating a lot of local grocery markets. There are 40 metro areas now where it has more than 70% of the market for groceries, an extraordinary power to squeeze farmers and food producers, that it's caused poverty across a lot of rural areas. That's not exactly something to hold up as a good thing. And Amazon is that and so much more. It's a sort of magnified version of that kind of market power because of that sort of control of basic infrastructure that we talked about. In terms of antitrust and sort of Brandeis, I think, antitrust has gone wrong over the last, 30 or 40 years by, sort of collapsing this multitude of values into this idea that the only purpose is greater efficiency, and baked into that idea is the notion that bigger is always more efficient, and therefore antitrust has basically been turned on its head, where we have consistently made enforcement decisions and policy choices that have driven consolidation rather than kept markets open, dynamic, and more competitive. In the years, beginning from sort of the New Deal, all the way through to this change that in antitrust policy, which really began in the 70s and 80s, it's no coincidence that that was a period of very broad prosperity, where we saw lots of new business creation, where we saw working people have more power than they've had. Antitrust wasn't the only reason, but it was a critical part of that New Deal framework of anti-monopoly, I should say. It wasn't the only reason for that broad prosperity, but it was an important part of the set of reasons that really enabled one of the most dynamic and prosperous times in our history.
Great, thank you. So I see we have come up to the end of our official time. We were informed by the gatekeepers we could go very slightly over. And so I would like to ask each of you, you were able to get in a lot in the last couple of questions. I guess, Steve, starting with you, since Stacy opened, I'll let you open the closing round. Keep it to just a minute or so, wrap up comments on this.
So it's very quick. This is a response to what Stacy just said. She's talking about Amazon. She's talking about US antitrust. And my view is technology is driving a lot of the things that she's talking about, which are worrisome, but it's not Amazon. This is a global phenomenon. This happens places where Amazon is not the leader. And this happens in places where there's stronger antitrust. And so I view technology as being quite different from what it was like, 20 or 30 years ago, or 40 years ago. It's probably started in the 90s. And that is a challenge for the economy and for politicians. How do you deal with the fact that technology has displaced a lot of workers, particularly in the developed countries? But I wouldn't blame Amazon. In the case of Amazon and the other platforms, they are bringing huge benefits to consumers, and I wouldn't want to jeopardize that.
Stacy, closing comments?
Well, I think perhaps I found a small kernel where Steve and I agree, which is that the problem isn't so much Amazon per se. The problem is policy. Amazon is a product of public policy. It's a product of changes in antitrust enforcement. It's a product of a set of tax and subsidy policies. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons that we have created a policy environment in which Amazon was allowed to amass this much power. And I think we're at a moment where we should ask ourselves, is this good for all of us? Is this good for the economy broadly? Is a single company having this kind of extraordinary control over many of the basic arteries of our everyday lives and of our economic system? Should any one person, any one company have that kind of power? As I said, I think that if we don't use policy to address Amazon, if we don't in effect regulate Amazon, then we're effectively allowing Amazon to regulate us, and I think that's really problematic.
Well, thank you both for what I think has been a great, lively, and enlivening, if not consensus-building conversation. This is usually the point where we would ask the audience to applaud, and I'm sorry that we can't offer you that. But I do want to thank both of you for your time. I want to thank the viewers for tuning in. I want to thank the Stigler Center for organizing this event. And I look forward to the time when we can have such a conversation at some point in person again. So meantime, everybody stay safe, and thank you so much for today's conversation.
Thank you.
Jake, thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Stacy and Jake.